Fortunately, though stunned and severely bruised, the general was only temporarily disabled, and if he appeared but little in public during his stay in Frederick, his inaccessibility was not due to broken bones. Lee, Longstreet, and Jackson, and for a time Jeb Stuart, writes a staff officer, had their headquarters near one another in Best's Grove. Hither in crowds came the good people of Frederick, especially the ladies, as to a fair. General Jackson, still suffering from his hurt, kept to his tent, busying himself with maps and official papers, and declined to see visitors. Once, however, when he had been called to General Lee's tent, 2 young girls waylaid him, paralyzed him with smiles and questions, and then jumped into their carriage and drove off rapidly, leaving him there, cap in hand, bowing, blushing, speechless. But once safe in his tent, he was seen no more that day. The next evening, Sunday, he went with his staff to service in the town and slept soundly, as he admitted to his wife, through the sermon of a minister of the German Reformed Church. September 10th. Lee had resolved to woo fortune while she was in the mood. The movement against Harper's Ferry once determined, it was essential that it should be carried out with the utmost speed, and Jackson marched with even more than ordinary haste, but without omitting his usual precautions. Before starting, he asked for a map of the Pennsylvania frontier and made many inquiries as to roads and localities to the north of Frederick, whereas his route lay in the opposite direction. The cavalry, which preceded the column, says Colonel Douglas, had instructions to let no civilian go to the front, and we entered each village we passed before the inhabitants knew of our coming. In Middletown, 2 very pretty girls, with ribbons of red, white, and blue floating from their hair, and small Union flags in their hands, rushed out of a house as we passed, came to the curbstone, and with much laughter waved their flags defiantly in the face of the general. He bowed, raised his hat, and turning with his quiet smile to the staff, said, "We evidently have no friends in this town." Sept. 11. Having crossed South Mountain at Turner's Gap, the command encamped for the night within a mile of Boonesborough, 14 miles from Frederick. Here General Jackson must determine whether he would go to Williamsport or turn towards Shepherdstown. I at once rode into the village with a cavalryman to make some inquiries, but we ran into a Federal squadron, who without ceremony proceeded to make war upon us. We retraced our steps, and although we did not stand upon the order of our going, a squad of them escorted us out of the town with great rapidity. Reaching the top of the hill, we discovered, just over it, General Jackson, walking slowly towards us, leading his horse. There was but one thing to do. Fortunately, the chase had become less vigorous, and with a cry of command to unseen troops, we turned and charged the enemy. They, suspecting trouble, turned and fled, while the general quickly galloped to the rear. As I returned to camp, I picked up the gloves which he had dropped in mounting and took them to him. Although he had sent a regiment of infantry to the front as soon as he went back, the only allusion he made to the incident was to express the opinion that I had a very fast horse. The next morning, having learned that the Federal troops still occupied Martinsburg, General Jackson took the direct road to Williamsport. He then forded the Potomac, the troops singing, the bands playing, "Carry me back to Old Virginie." We marched on Martinsburg. Sept. 12th. General A.P. Hill took the direct turnpike, while Jackson, with the rest of his command, followed a side road so as to approach Martinsburg from the west, and encamped 4 miles from the town. His object was to drive General White, who occupied Martinsburg, towards Harper's Ferry, and thus corral all the Federal troops in that military pen. As the Comte de Paris puts it, he organized a grand hunting match through the lower valley, driving all the Federal detachments before him and forcing them to crowd into the blind alley of Harper's Ferry. The next morning the Confederates entered Martinsburg. Here the general was welcomed with enthusiasm, and a great crowd hastened to the hotel to greet him. At first he shut himself up in a room to write dispatches, but the demonstration became so persistent that he ordered the door to be opened. The crowd, chiefly ladies, rushed in and embarrassed the general with every possible outburst of affection, to which he could only reply, "Thank you, you are very kind." He gave them his autograph in books and on scraps of paper, cut a button from his coat for a little girl, and then submitted patiently to an attack by the others, who soon stripped the coat of nearly all the remaining buttons. But when they looked beseechingly at his hair, which was thin, he drew the line and managed to close the interview. These blandishments did not delay his movements, however, for in the afternoon he was off again, and his troops bivouacked on the banks of the Opequon. Section 13. On the 13th, Jackson passed through Halltown and halted a mile north of that village, throwing out pickets to hold the roads which lead south and west from Harper's Ferry. Meanwhile, McLaws and Walker had taken possession of the heights to the north and east, and the entrenched camp of the Federals, which, in addition to the garrison, now held the troops who had fled from Martinsburg, was surrounded on every side. The Federal officer in command had left but one brigade and 2 batteries to hold the Maryland Heights, the long ridge, 1,000 feet high, on the north shore of the Potomac, which looks down on the streets of the little town. This detachment, although strongly posted, and covered by breastworks and abatis, was driven off by General McLaws, while the Loudoun Heights, a portion of the Blue Ridge, east of the Shenandoah, and almost equally commanding, were occupied without opposition by General Walker. Harper's Ferry was now completely surrounded. Lee's plans had been admirably laid and precisely executed, and the surrender of the place was merely a question of hours. Nor had matters progressed less favourably elsewhere. In exact accordance with the anticipations of Lee and Jackson, McClellan, up till noon on the 13th, had received no inkling whatever of the dangerous manoeuvres which Stuart so effectively concealed, and his march was very slow. On the 12th, after a brisk skirmish with the Confederate cavalry, his advanced guard had occupied Frederick, and discovered that the enemy had marched off in 2 columns, one towards Hagerstown, the other towards Harper's Ferry, but he was uncertain whether Lee intended to recross the Potomac or to move northwards into Pennsylvania. On the morning of the 13th, although General Hooker, commanding the 1st Army Corps, took the liberty of reporting that, in his opinion, the rebels had no more intention of going to Pennsylvania than they had of going to heaven, the Federal commander-in-chief was still undecided, and on the Boonesboro road only his cavalry was pushed forward. In 4 days, McClellan had marched no more than 25 miles. He had been unable to open communication with Harper's Ferry, and he had moved with even more than his usual caution. But at noon on the 13th, he was suddenly put into possession of the most ample information. A copy of Lee's order for the investment of Harper's Ferry, in which the exact position of each separate division of the Confederate Army was laid down, was picked up in the streets of Frederick, and chance had presented McClellan with an opportunity unique in history. He was within 20 miles of Harper's Ferry. The Confederates were more than that distance apart. The entrenched camp still held out, for the sound of McLaws's battle on the Maryland Heights was distinctly heard during the afternoon, and a resolute advance would have either compelled the Confederates to raise the siege or have placed the Federal army between their widely separated wings. But happily for the South, McClellan was not the man for the opportunity. He still hesitated, and during the afternoon of the 13th, only one division was pushed forward. In front of him was the South Mountain, the name given to the continuation of the Blue Ridge north of the Potomac, and the 2 passes, Turner's and Crampton's Gaps, were held by Stuart. No Confederate infantry, as Lee's order indicated, with the exception perhaps of a rear guard, were nearer the passes than the Maryland Heights and Boonesboro. The roads were good and the weather fine, and a night march of 12 miles would have placed the Federal advanced guards at the foot of the mountains, ready to force the gaps at earliest dawn. McClellan, however, although his men had made no unusual exertions during the past few days, preferred to wait till daylight. Nevertheless, on the night of the 13th disaster threatened the Confederates. Harper's Ferry had not yet fallen, and, in addition to the cavalry, D.H. Hill's division was alone available to defend the passes. Lee, however, still relying on McClellan's irresolution, determined to hold South Mountain, thus gaining time for the reduction of Harper's Ferry, and Longstreet was ordered back from Hagerstown, 13 miles west of Boonesboro, to Hill's assistance. September 14. On the same night, Jackson at Halltown opened communications with McLaws and Walker, and on the next morning, Sunday, he made the necessary arrangements to ensure combination in the attack. The Federal lines, although commanded by the Maryland and Loudoun Heights to the north and east, opposed a strong front to the south and west. The Bolivar Heights, an open plateau, 1.25 miles in length, which has the Potomac on the one flank and the Shenandoah on the other, was defended by several batteries and partially entrenched. Moreover, it was so far from the summits occupied by McLaws and Walker that their guns, although directed against the enemy's rear, could hardly render effective aid. Only the extremities of the plateau were thoroughly exposed to fire from the heights. In order to facilitate communication across the two great rivers, Jackson ordered a series of signal stations to be established, and while his own batteries were taking up their ground to assail the Bolivar Heights, he issued his instructions to his colleagues. At 10 o'clock, the flags on the Loudoun Heights signalled that Walker had 6 rifled guns in position. He was ordered to wait until McLaws, who was employed in cutting roads through the woods, should have done the same, and the following message explained the method of attack. General McLaws, if you can, establish batteries to drive the enemy from the hill west of Bolivar and on which Barber's house is, and from any other position where he may be damaged by your artillery. Let me know when you are ready to open your batteries, and give me any suggestions by which you can operate against the enemy. Cut the telegraph line down the Potomac if it is not already done. Keep a good lookout against a Federal advance from below. Similar instructions will be sent to General Walker. I do not desire any of the batteries to open until all are ready on both sides of the river, except you should find it necessary, of which you must judge for yourself. I will let you know when to open all the batteries. T.J. Jackson, Major General Commanding. About 2:30 in the afternoon, McLaws reported that his guns were up, and a message, to fire at such positions of the enemy as will be most effective, followed the formal orders for the cooperation of the whole force. Headquarters, Valley District, September 14, 1862. 1. Today, Major General McLaws will attack so as to sweep with his artillery the ground occupied by the enemy, take his batteries in reverse, and otherwise operate against him as circumstances may justify. 2. Brigadier General Walker will take in reverse the battery on the turnpike, and sweep with his artillery the ground occupied by the enemy, and silence the batteries on the island of the Shenandoah, should he find a battery, sick there. 3. Major General A.P. Hill will move along the left bank of the Shenandoah, and thus turn the enemy's left flank and enter Harper's Ferry. 4. Brigadier General Lawton will move along the turnpike for the purpose of supporting General Hill, and otherwise operating against the enemy to the left of General Hill. 5. Brigadier General Jones will, with one of his brigades and a battery of artillery, make a demonstration against the enemy's right. The remaining part of his division will constitute the reserve and move along the turnpike. By order of Major General Jackson, W.M. L. Jackson, Acting Assistant Adjutant General. Jackson, it appears, was at first inclined to send a flag of truce for the purpose of giving the civilian population time to get away should the garrison refuse to surrender. But during the morning, heavy firing was heard to the northward, and McLaws reported that he had been obliged to detach troops to guard his rear against McClellan. The batteries were therefore ordered to open fire on the Federal works without further delay. According to General Walker, Jackson, although he was aware that McClellan had occupied Frederick, not over 20 miles distant, could not bring himself to believe that his old classmate had overcome his prudential instincts, and attributed the sounds of battle to a cavalry engagement. It is certain that he never for a single moment anticipated a resolute attempt to force the passages of the South Mountain, for, in reply to McLaws, he merely instructed him to ask General P. H. Hill to protect his rear, and to communicate with Lee at Hagerstown. Had he entertained the slightest suspicion that McClellan was advancing with his whole force against the passages of the South Mountain, he would hardly have suggested that Hill would be asked to defend Crampton's as well as Turner's Gap. With full confidence, therefore, that he would have time to enforce the surrender of Harper's Ferry and to join Lee on the further bank of the Potomac, the progress of his attack was cautious and methodical. "The position in front of me," he wrote to McLaws, "is a strong one, and I desire to remain quiet, and let you and Walker draw attention from Furnace Hill, west of Bolivar Heights, so that I may have an opportunity of getting possession of the hill without much loss." It was not, then, till the artillery had been long in action, and the fire of the enemy's guns had been in some degree subdued, that the infantry was permitted to advance. Although the Federal batteries opened vigorously on the lines of skirmishers, the casualties were exceedingly few. The troops found cover in woods and broken ground, and before nightfall Hill had driven in the enemy's pickets and had secured a knoll on their left flank which afforded an admirable position for artillery. Lawton, in the centre, occupied a ridge over which ran the Charlestown Turnpike, brought his guns into action, and formed his regiments for battle in the woods. Jones's division held the Shepherdstown road on Lawton's left, seized Furnace Hill, and pushed 2 batteries forward. No attempt was made during this Sunday evening to storm the Bolivar Heights, and yet, although the Confederate infantry had been hardly engaged, the enemy had been terribly shaken. From every point of the compass, from the lofty crests which looked down upon the town, from the woods towards Charlestown, from the hill to westward, a ceaseless hail of shells had swept the narrow neck to which the garrison was confined. Several guns had been dismounted. More than one regiment of raw troops had dispersed in panic, and had been with difficulty rallied. The roads were furrowed with iron splinters. Many buildings had been demolished, and although the losses among the infantry, covered by their parapets, had been insignificant, the batteries had come almost to their last round. During the night, Jackson made preparations for an early assault. 2 of A. P. Hill's brigades, working their way along the bank of the Shenandoah, over ground which the Federal commander had considered impassable, established themselves to the left rear of the Bolivar Heights. Guns were brought up to the knoll which Hill had seized during the afternoon, and 10 pieces, which Jackson had ordered to be taken across the Shenandoah by Keyes's Ford, were placed in a position whence they could enfilade the enemy's works at effective range. Lawton and Jones pushed forward their lines until they could hear voices in the entrenchments, and a girdle of bayonets, closely supported by many batteries, encircled the hapless Federals. The assault was to be preceded by a heavy bombardment, and the advance was to be made as soon as Hill's guns ceased fire. Sept. 15. All night long the Confederates slept upon their arms, waiting for the dawn. When day broke, a soft silver mist, rising from the broad Potomac, threw its protecting folds over Harper's Ferry. But the Southern gunners knew the direction of their targets. The clouds were rent by the passage of screaming shells, and as the sun, rising over the Loudoun Heights, dispersed the vapour, the whole of Jackson's artillery became engaged. The Federal batteries, worked with stubborn courage, and showing a bold front to every fresh opponent, maintained the contest for an hour. But even if ammunition had not failed them, they could not have long withstood the terrible fire which took them in front, in flank, and in reverse. Then, perceiving that the enemy's guns were silenced, Hill ordered his batteries to cease fire and threw forward his brigades against the ridge. Staunch to the last, the Federal artillerymen ran their pieces forward and opened on the Confederate infantry. Once more the long line of Jackson's guns crashed out in answer, and 2 batteries, galloping up to within 400 yards of the ridge, poured in a destructive fire over the heads of their own troops. Hill's brigades, when the artillery duel recommenced, had halted at the foot of the slope. Beyond, over the bare fields, the way was obstructed by felled timber, the lopped branches of which were closely interlaced, and above the abatis rose the line of breastworks. But before the charge was sounded, the Confederate gunners completed the work they had so well begun. At 7:30 a.m. the white flag was hoisted, and with the loss of no more than 100 men, Jackson had captured Harper's Ferry with his artillery alone. The general was near the church in the wood on the Charlestown Road, and Colonel Douglas was sent forward to ascertain the enemy's purpose. "Near the top of the hill," he writes, "I met General White, commanding the Federals, and told him my mission. Just then General Hill came up from the direction of his line, and on his request I conducted them to General Jackson, whom I found sitting on his horse where I had left him. He was not, as the Comte de Paris says, leaning against a tree asleep, but exceedingly wide awake." The surrender was unconditional, and then General Jackson turned the matter over to General A.P. Hill, who allowed General White the same liberal terms that Grant afterwards gave Lee at Appomattox. The fruits of the surrender were 12,520 prisoners, 13,000 small arms, 73 pieces of artillery, and several hundred wagons. General Jackson, after a brief dispatch to General Lee announcing the capitulation, rode up to Bolivar and down into Harper's Ferry. The curiosity in the Union army to see him was so great that the soldiers lined the sides of the road. Many of them uncovered as he passed, and he invariably returned the salute. One man had an echo of response all about him when he said aloud, "Boys, he's not much for looks, but if we'd had him we wouldn't have been caught in this trap." The completeness of the victory was marred by the escape of the Federal cavalry. Under cover of the night, 200 horsemen, crossing the Ponton Bridge and passing swiftly up the towpath under the Maryland Heights, had ridden boldly beneath the muzzles of McLaws's batteries, and moving northwest had struck out for Pennsylvania. Yet the capture of Harper's Ferry was a notable exploit, although Jackson seems to have looked upon it as a mere matter of course. "Through God's blessing," he reported to Lee at 8 o'clock, "Harper's Ferry and its garrison are to be surrendered. As Hill's troops have borne the heaviest part of the engagement, he will be left in command until the prisoners and public property shall be disposed of, unless you direct otherwise. The other forces can move off this evening so soon as they get their rations. To what point shall they move? I write at this time in order that you may be apprised of the condition of things. You may expect to hear from me again today, after I get more information respecting the number of prisoners, etc." Lee, with D.H. Hill, Longstreet, and Stewart, was already falling back from the South Mountain to Sharpsburg, a little village on the right bank of the Antietam Creek, and late in the afternoon Jackson, Walker, and McLaws were ordered to rejoin without delay. September 14th. September 14th had been an anxious day for the Confederate Commander-in-Chief. During the morning D.H. Hill, with no more than 5,000 men in his command, had seen the greater part of McClellan's army deploy for action in the wide valley below and to the eastward of Turner's Gap. Stewart held the woods below Crampton's Gap, 6 miles south, with Robertson's brigade, now commanded by the gallant Munford, and on the heights above McLaws had posted 3 brigades. For against this important pass, the shortest route by which the Federals could interpose between Lee and Jackson, McClellan's left wing, consisting of 20,000 men under General Franklin, was steadily advancing. The positions at both Turner's and Crampton's Gaps were very strong. The passes, at their highest points, are at least 600 feet above the valley, and the slopes steep, rugged, and thickly wooded. The enemy's artillery had little chance. Stone walls, running parallel to the crest, gave much protection to the Southern infantry, and loose boulders and rocky scarps increased the difficulties of the ascent. But the numbers available for defence were very small, and had McClellan marched during the night he would probably have been master of the passes before midday. As it was, Crampton's Gap was not attacked by Franklin until noon, and although at the same hour the advanced guard of the Federal right wing had gained much ground, it was not till 4 in the evening that a general attack was made on Turner's Gap. By this time Longstreet, after a march of 13 miles, had reached the battlefield, and despite the determination with which the attack was pressed, Turner's Gap was still held when darkness fell. The defence of Crampton's Gap had been less successful. Franklin had forced the pass before 5 o'clock, and driving McLaws' 3 brigades before him, had firmly established himself astride the summit. The Confederate losses were larger than those which they had inflicted. McClellan reports 1,791 casualties on the right, Franklin 533 on the left. McLaws' and Munford's loss was over 800, of whom 400 were captured. The number of killed and wounded in Hill's and Longstreet's commands is unknown. It probably reached a total of 1,500, and 100 of their men were marched to Frederick as prisoners. Thus the day's fighting had cost the South 3,400 men. Moreover, Longstreet's ammunition column, together with an escort of 600 men, had been cut up by the cavalry which had escaped from Harper's Ferry, and which had struck the Hagerstown road as it marched northward into Pennsylvania. Yet, on the whole, Lee had no reason to be chagrined with the result of his operations. McClellan had acted with unexpected vigour, but neither in strategy nor in tactics had he displayed improvement on his peninsular methods. He should have thrown the bulk of his army against Crampton's Gap, thus intervening between Lee and Jackson, but instead of doing so he had directed 70,000 men against Turner's Gap. Nor had the attack on Hill and Longstreet been characterized by resolution. The advanced guard was left unsupported until 2 p.m., and not more than 30,000 men were employed throughout the day. Against this number, 8,000 Confederates had held the pass. Cobb, one of McLaws's brigadiers, who commanded the defence at Crampton's Gap, though driven down the mountain, had offered a stout resistance to superior forces, and 24 hours had been gained for Jackson. On the other hand, in face of superior numbers, the position at Turner's Gap had become untenable, and during the night Hill and Longstreet marched to Sharpsburg. September 15th. This enforced retreat was not without effect on the morale of either army. McClellan was as exultant as he was credulous. "I have just learned," he reported to Halleck at 8 a.m. on the 15th, "from General Hooker in advance that the enemy is making for Shepherdstown in a perfect panic, and that General Lee last night stated publicly that he must admit they had been shockingly whipped. I am hurrying forward to endeavour to press their retreat to the utmost." Then, 2 hours later, "Information this moment received completely confirms the rout and demoralization of the rebel army. It is stated that Lee gives his losses as 15,000. We are following as rapidly as the men can move." Nor can it be doubted that McClellan's whole army, unaccustomed to see their antagonists give ground before them, shared the general's mood. Amongst the Confederates, on the other hand, there was some depression. It could not be disguised that a portion of the troops had shown symptoms of demoralization. The retreat to the Antietam, although effectively screened by Fitzhugh Lee's brigade of cavalry, was not effected in the best of order. Many of the regiments had been broken by the hard fighting on the mountain. Men had become lost in the forest or had sought safety to the rear, and the number of stragglers was very large. It was not then, with its usual confidence, that the army moved into position on the ridge above the Antietam Creek. General Longstreet, indeed, was of opinion that the army should have recrossed the Potomac at once. The moral effect of our move into Maryland had been lost by our discomfiture at South Mountain, and it was evident we could not hope to concentrate in time to do more than make a respectable retreat, whereas by retiring before the Battle of Sharpsburg we could have claimed a very successful campaign. So spake the voice of prudence. Lee, however, so soon as he was informed of the fall of Harper's Ferry, had ordered Jackson to join him, resolving to hold his ground and to bring McClellan to a decisive battle on the north bank of the Potomac. Although 45,000 men, for Lee at most could count on no more than this number, so great had been the straggling, were about to receive the attack of over 90,000, Jackson, when he reached Sharpsburg on the morning of the 16th, heartily approved the Commander-in-Chief's decision, and it is worthwhile to consider the reasons which led them to disagree with Longstreet. Under ordinary conditions, to expect an army of 45,000 to wrest decisive victory from one of 90,000 well-armed enemies would be to demand an impossibility. The defence, when two armies are equally matched, is physically stronger than the attack, although we have Napoleon's word for it that the defence has the harder task, but that the inherent strength of the defence is so great as to enable the smaller force to annihilate its enemy is contrary to all the teaching of history. By making good use of favourable ground, or by constructing substantial works, the smaller force may indeed stave off defeat and gain time, but it can hope for nothing more. The records of warfare contain no instance, when two armies were of much the same quality, of the smaller army bringing the campaign to a decisive issue by defensive tactics. Wellington and Lee both fought many defensive battles with inferior forces, but neither of them, under such conditions, ever achieved the destruction of their enemy. They fought such battles to gain time, and their hopes soared no higher. At Talavera, Busaco, Fuentes d'Honor, where the French were superior to the Allies, Wellington repulsed the attack, but he did not prevent the defeated armies taking the field again in a few days. At the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, the North Anna, and Cold Harbor, the great battles of 1864, Lee maintained his ground, but he did not prevent Grant moving round his flank in the direction of Richmond. At the Second Manassas, Jackson stood fast for the greater part of 2 days, but he would never have driven Pope across Bull Run without the aid of Longstreet. Porter at Gaines's Mill held 55,000 men with 35,000 for more than 7 hours, but even if he had maintained his position, the Confederate army would not have become a mob of fugitives. No, except on peculiarly favourable ground, or when defending an entrenched camp, an army matched with one of equal efficiency and numerically superior can never hope for decisive success. So circumstanced, a wise general will rather retreat than fight, and thus save his men for a more favourable opportunity. But Lay and Jackson had not to deal with ordinary conditions. Whatever may have been the case in the Peninsula and in the Valais, there can be no question but that the armies in Maryland were by no means equal in quality. The Federals were far more accustomed to retreat than advance. For several months, whether they were engaged on the Shenandoah, on the Chickahominy, on the Rappahannock, or on Bull Run, they had been invariably outmanoeuvred. Their losses had been exceedingly severe, not only in battle, but from sickness and straggling. Many of their bravest officers and men had fallen. With the exception of the 2nd and 6th Army Corps, commanded by Sumner and by Franklin, by far the greater part of the troops had been involved in Pope's defeat, and they had not that trust in their leaders which promises a strong offensive. While at Washington, the army had been reinforced by 24 regiments of infantry, but the majority of these troops had been but lately raised. They knew little of drill. They were commanded by officers as ignorant as themselves, and they had never fired a musket. Nor were the generals equal in capacity to those opposing them. If a student of history, says a Northern officer, familiar with the characters who figured in the War of Secession, but happening to be ignorant of the Battle of Antietam, should be told the names of the men who held high commands there, he would say that with anything like equality of forces the Confederates must have won, for their leaders were men who made great names in the war, while the Federal leaders were, with few exceptions, men who never became conspicuous, or became conspicuous only through failure. And the difference in military capacity extended to the rank and file. When the two armies met on the Antietam, events had been such as to confer a marked superiority on the Southerners. They were the children of victory, and every man in the army had participated in the successes of Lee and Jackson. They had much experience of battle. They were supremely confident in their own prowess, for the fall of Harper's Ferry had made more than amends for the retreat from South Mountain, and they were supremely confident in their leaders. No new regiments weakened the stability of their array. Every brigade and every regiment could be depended on. The artillery, which had been but lately reorganized in battalions, had, under the fostering care of General Pendleton, become peculiarly efficient, although the materiel was still indifferent, and against Stuart's horsemen the Federal cavalry was practically useless. In every military attribute, then, the Army of Northern Virginia was so superior to the Army of the Potomac that Lee and Jackson believed that they might fight a defensive battle, outnumbered as they were, with the hope of annihilating their enemy. They were not especially favoured by the ground, and time and means for entrenching were both wanting. But they were assured that not only were their veterans capable of holding the position, but, if favoured by fortune, of delivering a counterstroke which should shiver the Army of the Potomac into 1,000 fragments. By retreating across the Potomac, in accordance with General Longstreet's suggestion, Lee would certainly have avoided all chances of disaster, but at the same time he would have abandoned a good hope of ending the war. The enemy would have been fully justified in assuming that the retrograde movement had been made under the compulsion of his advance, and the balance of moral have been sensibly affected in favour of the Federals. If the Potomac had once been placed between the opposing forces, McClellan would have had it in his power to postpone an encounter until his army was strongly reinforced, his raw regiments trained, and his troops rested. The passage of the river, it is true, had been successfully forced by the Confederates on September 5th, but it by no means followed that it could be forced for the second time in face of a concentrated enemy, who would have had time to recover his moral and supply his losses. McClellan, so long as the Confederates remained in Maryland, had evidently made up his mind to attack. But if Maryland was evacuated, he would probably content himself with holding the line of the Potomac, and, in view of the relative strength of the two armies, it would be an extraordinary stroke of fortune which should lay him open to assault. Lee and Jackson were firmly convinced that it was the wiser policy to give the enemy no time to reorganize and recruit, but to coerce him to battle before he had recovered from the defeat which he had sustained on the heights above Bull Run. To recross the Potomac would be to slight the favours of fortune, to abandon the initiative, and to submit, in face of the vast numbers of fresh troops which the North was already raising, to a defensive warfare, a warfare which might protract the struggle, but which must end in the exhaustion of the Confederacy. McClellan's own words are the strongest justification of the views held by the Southern leaders. The Army of the Potomac was thoroughly exhausted and depleted by the desperate fighting and severe marching in the unhealthy regions of the Chickahominy, and afterwards, during the Second Bull Run campaign. Its trains, administrative services and supplies were disorganized or lacking in consequence of the rapidity and manner of its removal from the peninsula, as well as from the nature of its operations during the Second Bull Run campaign. Had General Lee remained in front of Washington, south of the Potomac, it would have been the part of wisdom to hold our own army quiet until its pressing wants were fully supplied, its organization was restored, and its ranks were filled with recruits, in brief, until it was prepared for a campaign. But as the enemy maintained the offensive and crossed the upper Potomac to threaten or invade Pennsylvania, it became necessary to meet him at any cost, notwithstanding the condition of the troops, to put a stop to the invasion, to save Baltimore and Washington, and throw him back across the Potomac. Nothing but sheer necessity justified the advance of the Army of the Potomac to South Mountain and Antietam in its then condition. The purpose of advancing from Washington was simply to meet the necessities of the moment by frustrating Lee's invasion of the northern states, and when that was accomplished, to push with the utmost rapidity the work of reorganization and supply, so that a new campaign might be promptly inaugurated with the army in condition to prosecute it to a successful termination without intermission. And in his official report showing what the result of a Confederate success might well have been, he says, "One battle lost, and almost all would have been lost. Lee's army might have marched as it pleased on Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, or New York. It could have levied its supplies from a fertile and undevastated country, extorted tribute from wealthy and populous cities, and nowhere east of the Alleghanies was there another organized force to avert its march." The situation in the West was such that even a victory in Maryland was exceedingly desirable. Confederate movements in Tennessee and Kentucky had won a measure of success, which bade fair to open up a brilliant opportunity. Should the Federals be defeated in both the theatres of war, the blow would be felt throughout the length and breadth of the northern states, and, in any case, it was of the utmost importance that all McClellan's troops should be retained in the east. So, when the tidings came of Jackson's victory at Harper's Ferry, Both armies braced themselves for the coming battle, the Confederates in the hope that it would be decisive of the war, the Federals that it would save the capital. But the Confederates had still a most critical time before them, and Lee's daring was never more amply illustrated than when he made up his mind to fight on the Antietam. McClellan's great army was streaming through the passes of the South Mountain. At Rohrersville, 6 miles east of the Confederate bivouacs, where he had halted as soon as the cannonade at Harper's Ferry ceased, Franklin was still posted with 20,000 men. From their battlefield at Turner's Gap, 10 miles from Sharpsburg, came the 70,000 which composed the right and centre, and on the banks of the Antietam, but 15,000 Southerners were in position. Jackson had to get rid of his prisoners, to march 17 miles, and to ford the Potomac before he could reach the ground. Walker was 20 miles distant beyond the Shenandoah, and McLaws, who would be compelled by Franklin's presence near Rohrersville to cross at Harper's Ferry and follow Jackson, over 5 and 20. Would they be up before McClellan attacked? Lee, relying on McClellan's caution and Jackson's energy, answered the question in the affirmative. The September day wore on, the country between the South Mountain and Sharpsburg, resembling in every characteristic the valley of the Shenandoah, is open and gently undulating. No leagues of woodland, as in eastern Virginia, block the view. The roads run through wide cornfields and rolling pastures, and scattered copses are the only relics of the forest. It was not yet noon when the Federal scouts appeared among the trees which crown the left bank of the Antietam Creek. The number increased, and larger grew the field of blue until it seemed to stretch as far as the eye could see. It was an awe-inspiring spectacle, adds Longstreet, as this grand force settled down in sight of the Confederates, shattered by battles and scattered by long and tedious marches. But when night fell upon the field, the only interchange of hostilities had been a brief engagement of artillery. McClellan's advance, owing to the difficulty of passing his great army through the mountains and to the scarcity of roads, had been slow and tedious. In some of the divisions there had been unnecessary delay, and Lee had so disposed his force that the Federal commander, unenlightened as to the real strength of his adversary, believed that he was opposed by 50,000 men. Nor was the next morning marked by any increase of activity. McClellan, although he should have been well aware that a great part of the Confederate army was still west of the Potomac, made no attack. It was discovered, he reports, that the enemy had changed the position of some of his batteries. The masses of his troops, however, were still concealed behind the opposite heights. It was afternoon before I could move the troops to their positions for attack, being compelled to spend the morning in reconnoitring the new position taken up by the enemy, examining the ground and finding fords, clearing the approaches, and hurrying up the ammunition and supply trains. Considering that McClellan had been in possession of the left bank of the Antietam since the forenoon of the previous day, all these preliminaries might well have been completed before daylight on the 16th. That a change in the dispositions of a few batteries, a change so unimportant as to pass unnoticed in the Confederate reports, should have imposed a delay, when every moment was precious, of many hours, proves that Lee's and Jackson's estimate of their opponent's character was absolutely correct. While McClellan was reconnoitering and the guns were thundering across the Antietam, Jackson and Walker crossed the Potomac and reported to Lee in Sharpsburg. Walker had expected to find the commander-in-chief anxious and careworn. Anxious, no doubt he was, but there was nothing in his look or manner to indicate it. On the contrary, he was calm, dignified, and even cheerful. If he had had a well-equipped army of 100,000 veterans at his back, he could not have appeared more composed and confident. On shaking hands with us, he simply expressed his satisfaction with the result of our operations at Harper's Ferry, and with our timely arrival at Sharpsburg, adding that with our reinforcements he felt confident of being able to hold his ground until the arrival of the divisions of R. H. Anderson, McLaws, and A. P. Hill, which were still behind, and which did not arrive till next day. Yet the reinforcements which Jackson and Walker had brought up were no considerable addition to Lee's strength. Jones's division consisted of no more than 1,600 muskets, Lawtons of less than 3,500. Including officers and artillery, therefore, the effectives of these divisions numbered about 5,500. A.P. Hill's division appears to have mustered 5,000 officers and men, and we may add 1,000 for men sick or on detached duties. The total should undoubtedly have been larger. After the Battle of Cedar Run, Jackson had 22,450 effectives in his ranks. His losses in the operations against Pope and the transfer of Robertson's cavalry to Stuart had brought his numbers down by 5,787, but on September 16th, including 70 killed or wounded at Harper's Ferry, they should have been not less than 16,800. In reality, they were only 11,500. We have not far to look for the cause of this reduction. Many of the men had absented themselves before the army crossed into Maryland, and if those who remained with the colours had seen little fighting since Pope's defeat, they had had no reason to complain of inactivity. The operations which resulted in the capture of Harper's Ferry had been arduous in the extreme. Men who had taken part in the forced marches of the Valley Campaign declared that the march from Frederick to Harper's Ferry surpassed all their former experiences. In 3.5 days they had covered over 60 miles, crossing 2 mountain ranges and fording the Potomac. The weather had been intensely hot, and the dust was terrible. Nor had the investment of Harper's Ferry been a period of repose. They had been under arms during the night which preceded the surrender, awaiting the signal to assault within a few hundred yards of the enemy's sentries. As soon as the terms of capitulation were arranged, they had been hurried back to the bivouac, had cooked 2 days' rations, and shortly after midnight had marched to the Potomac, 17 miles away. This night march, coming on the top of their previous exertions, had taxed the strength of many beyond endurance. The majority were badly shod. Many were not shod at all. They were ill-fed, and men ill-fed are on the high road to the hospital. There were stragglers, then, from every company in the command. Even the Stonewall Brigade, though it had still preserved its 5 regiments, was reduced to 300 muskets, and the other brigades of Jackson's division were but little stronger. Walker's division, too, although less hardly used in the campaign than the Valley troops, had diminished under the strain of the night march, and mustered no more than 3,500 officers and men at Sharpsburg. Thus, the masses of troops which McClellan conceived were hidden in the rear of D.H. Hill and Longstreet amounted in reality to some 10,000 effective soldiers. It was fortunate indeed that in their exhausted condition there was no immediate occasion for their services on September 16th. The shadows grew longer, but yet the Federals made no move. Even the fire of the artillery died away, and the men slept quietly in the woods to the north and west of the little town. Meanwhile, in an old house, one of the few which had any pretensions to comfort in Sharpsburg, the generals met in council. Staff officers strolled to and fro over the broad brick pavement. The horses stood lazily under the trees which shaded the dusty road, and within, Lee, Jackson, and Longstreet pored long and earnestly over the map of Maryland during the bright September afternoon. But before the glow of a lovely sunset had faded from the sky, the artillery once more opened on the ridge above, and reports came in that the Federals were crossing the Antietam near Prize Mill. Lee at once ordered Longstreet to meet this threat with Hood's division, and Jackson was ordered into line on the left of Hood. No serious collision, however, took place during the evening. The Confederates made no attempt to oppose the passage of the creek. Hood's pickets were driven in, but a speedy reinforcement restored the line, and except that the batteries on both sides took part, the fighting was little more than an affair of outposts. At 11 o'clock, Hood's brigades were withdrawn to cook and eat. Jackson's division filled their place, and the night, although broken by constant alarms, passed away without further conflict. The Federal movements had clearly exposed their intention of attacking, and had even revealed the point which they would first assail. McClellan had thrown 2 army corps, the 1st under Hooker and the 12th under Mansfield, across the Antietam, and they were now posted facing southward, 1.5 miles north of Sharpsburg, concealed by the wood beyond Jackson's left. Chapter 19. Sharpsburg. Sept and Scene 17. It is a curious coincidence that not only were the number of the opposing armies at the Battle of Sharpsburg almost identical with those of the French and Germans at the Battle of Worth, but that there is no small resemblance between the natural features and surrounding scenery of the two fields. Full in front of the Confederate position rises the Red Hill, a spur of the South Mountain, wooded, like the Vosges, to the very crest, and towering high above the fields of Maryland, as the Hochwald towers above the Rhineland. The Antietam, however, is a more difficult obstacle than the Sauerbach, the brook which meanders through the open meadows of the Alsatian valley. A deep channel of more than 60 feet in width is overshadowed by forest trees, and the ground on either bank ascends at a sharp gradient to the crests above. Along the ridge to the west, which parts the Antietam from the Potomac, and about a mile distant from the former stream, runs the Hagerstown Turnpike, and in front of this road there was a strong position. Sharpsburg, a village of a few hundred inhabitants, lies on the reverse slope of the ridge, extending in the direction of the Potomac, and only the church steeples were visible to the Federals. Above the hamlet was the Confederate centre. Here, near a limestone boulder, which stood in a plot which is now included in the Soldiers' Cemetery, was Lee's station during the long hours of September 17th, and from this point he overlooked the whole extent of his line of battle. A mile northward, on the Hagerstown Pike, his loft centre was marked by a square white building, famous under the name of the Dunkard Church, and backed by a long dark wood. To the right, a mile southward, a bold spur covered with scattered trees forces the Antietam westward, and on this spur, overlooking the stream, he had placed his right. Between the Hagerstown Pike and the Antietam, the open slopes, although not always uniform, but broken, like those on the French side of the Sauerbach, by long ravines, afforded an admirable field of fire. The lanes which cross them are sunk in many places below the surface. In front of Sharpsburg the fields were divided by low stone walls, and these natural entrenchments added much to the strength of the position. Nor were they the only advantages. The belt of oaks beyond the Dunkard Church, the West Wood, was peculiarly adapted for defence. Parallel ledges of outcropping limestone, both within the thickets and along the Hagerstown road, rising as high as a man's waist, gave good cover from shot and shell. The trees were of old growth, and there was little underwood. To the northeast, however, and about 500 yards distant across the fields, lay the East Wood, covering the slopes to the Antietam, with Poffenberger's Wood beyond, while further to the left the North Wood, extending across the Hagerstown Pike, approached the Confederate flank. The enemy, if he advanced to the attack in this quarter of the field, would thus find ample protection during his march and deployment, and in case of reverse he would find a rallying point in the North and Poffenberger's Woods, of which Hooker was already in possession. In the space between the woods were several small farms, surrounded by orchards and stone fences, and on the slope east of the Dunkard Church stood a few cottages and barns. Access to the position was not easy. Only a single ford near Snavely's house exists across the Antietam, and this was commanded by the bluff on the Confederate right. The stone bridges, however, for want of time and means to destroy them, had been left standing. That nearest the confluence of the Antietam and the Potomac, at the Antietam Iron Works, by which A.P. Hill was expected, was defended by rifle pits and enfiladed by artillery. The next, known as the Burnside Bridge, was completely overlooked by the heights above. That opposite Lee's centre could be raked throughout its length, but the fourth, at Prize Mill, by which Hooker and Mansfield had already crossed, was covered both from view and fire. Roads within the position were numerous. The Hagerstown Turnpike, concealed for some distance on either side of Sharpsburg by the crest of the ridge, was admirably adapted for the movement of reserves, and another broad highway ran through Sharpsburg to the Potomac. The position, then, in many respects, was well adapted to Lee's purpose. The flanks were reasonably secure. The right rested on the Antietam. The left was more open, but the West Wood formed a strong point d'appui, and beyond the wood a low ridge rising above Nicodemus Run gave room for several batteries, while the Potomac was so close that the space available for attack on this flank was much restricted. The ground could thus be held by a comparatively small number of men, and a large reserve set free for the counterstroke. The great drawback was that the ridge east of the Antietam, although commanded by the crest which the Confederates occupied, would permit McClellan to deploy the whole of his powerful artillery, and in no place did the range exceed 2,000 yards. In case of retreat, moreover, the Potomac, 200 yards from shore to shore, would have to be crossed by a few deep fords, of which only one was practicable for wagons. These disadvantages, however, it was impossible to avoid, and if the counterstroke were decisive, they would not be felt. The left of the position was assigned to Jackson, with Hood in third line. Next in order came D. H. Hill. Longstreet held the centre and the right, with Walker in reserve behind the flank. Stuart, with Fitzhugh Lee's brigade and his 4 guns, was between the West Wood and the Potomac. Munford's 2 regiments of cavalry, reinforced by a battery, held the bridge at the Antietam Ironworks, and kept open the communication with Harper's Ferry, and 26 rifled pieces of the reserve artillery were with D. H. Hill. From the Nicodemus Run to the bluff overhanging the Burnside Bridge is just 3 miles, and for the occupation of this front the following troops were at Lee's disposal. On the far side of the Potomac, the Shepherdstown Ford was protected by the remainder of the reserve artillery with an infantry escort. But so small was the force whose retreat was thus secured that nearly every man was required in the fighting line. Except the divisions of Hood and Walker, 5,500 men all told, there was no immediate reserve. But at daybreak on the 17th, the troops which had been left at Harper's Ferry were rapidly coming up. McLaws and Anderson, who had started before midnight, were already nearing the Potomac. Hampton's cavalry brigade was not far behind, and orders had been dispatched to A. P. Hill. But could these 13,000 bayonets be up in time, before Hooker and Mansfield received strong support, or before the Burnside Bridge was heavily attacked? The question was indeed momentous. If the Federals were to put forth their whole strength without delay, bring their numerous artillery into action, and press the battle at every point, it seemed hardly possible that defeat could be averted. McClellan, however, who had never yet ventured on a resolute offensive, was not likely in Lee's judgment to assault so strong a position as that held by the Confederates with wholehearted energy, and it was safe to calculate that his troops would be feebly handled. Yet the odds were great. Even after the arrival of the absent divisions, no more than 35,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 194 guns would be in line, and the enemy's numbers were far superior. McClellan had called in Franklin from Rohrersville, and his muster roll was imposing. In comparison with the masses arrayed between the Red Hill and the Antietam, the Confederate army was but a handful. 5 a.m. Notwithstanding McClellan's caution, the opening of the battle was not long delayed. Before sunrise, the desultory firing of the pickets had deepened to the roar of battle. Hooker, who had been ordered to begin the attack, forming his troops behind the North Wood, directed them on the Dunkard Church, which, standing on rising ground, appeared the key of the position. Jackson had already thrown back his 2 divisions at nearly a right angle to the Confederate front. His right, which connected with the left of D. H. Hill, and resting on the western edge of the East Wood extended as far as the Miller House, was held by Lawton, with 2 brigades in front and 1 in second line. West of the Hagerstown Turnpike, and covering the ground as far as the Nicodemus Farm, was Jones's division. The Stonewall and Jones's brigades in front, Taliaferro's and Starker's along the edge of the wood in rear. 3 guns stood upon the turnpike. The remainder of the artillery, 13 guns, was with Stuart on the high ground north of Nicodemus Run. Hood, in third line, stood near the Dunkard Church, and on Hood's right were 3 of Longstreet's batteries under Colonel Stephen Lee. The ground which Jackson had been ordered to occupy was not unfavourable for defence, although the troops had practically no cover except the rail fences and the rocky ledges. There was a wide and open field of fire, and when the Federal skirmishers appeared north of the Miller House, the Confederate batteries, opening with vigour at a range of 800 yards, struck down 16 men at the first salvo. This fire, and the stubborn resistance of the pickets, held the enemy for some time in check. But Hooker deployed 6 batteries in reply, and after a cannonade of nearly an hour his infantry advanced. From the cover of the woods, still veiled by the morning mist, the Federals came forward in strong force. Across the dry ploughed land in Lawton's front the fight grew hot, and on the far side of the turnpike the meadows round the Nicodemus farm became the scene of a desperate struggle. Hooker had sent in 2 divisions, Meade on the left and Doubleday on the right, while a third under Ricketts acted in close support of Meade. The attack was waged with the dash and energy which had earned for Hooker the sobriquet of Fighting Joe, and the troops he commanded had already proved their mettle on many murderous fields. Meade's Pennsylvanians, together with the Indiana and Wisconsin regiments which had wrought such havoc in Jackson's ranks at Grovetown, were once more bearing down upon his line. Nor were the tactics of the leaders ill calculated to second the valour of the troops. Hooker's whole army corps of 12,500 men was manoeuvred in close combination. The second line was so posted as to render quick support. No portion of the front was without an adequate reserve in rear. The artillery was used in mass, and the flanks were adequately guarded. The conflict between soldiers so well matched was not less fierce than when they had met on other fields. Hooker's troops had won a large measure of success at South Mountain 3 days previously, and their blood was up. Meade, Gibbon, and Ricketts were there to lead them, and the battle opened with a resolution which, if it had infected McClellan, would have carried the Sharpsburg Ridge ere set of sun. Stubborn was the resistance of Jackson's regiments, unerring the aim of his seasoned riflemen, but the opposing infantry, constantly reinforced, pressed irresistibly forward, and the heavy guns beyond the Antietam, finding an opening between the woods, swept the thin grey line from end to end. Jones's division, after fighting for 3/4 of an hour on the meadows, fell back to the west wood. General Jones was carried wounded from the field, and the guns on the turnpike were abandoned. 6:30 a.m. So tremendous was the fire that the corn, said Hooker, over 30 acres was cut as close by the bullets as if it had been reaped with the sickle, and the dead lay piled in regular ranks along the whole Confederate front. Never, he added, had been seen a more bloody or dismal battlefield. To the east of the turnpike, Lawton's division, strengthened at the critical moment by the brigade in second line, held Meade in check, and with a sharp counterstroke drove the Pennsylvanians back upon their guns. But Gibbon, fighting fiercely in the centre by the Miller House, brought up a battery in close support of his first line, and pressed heavily on the west wood until the Confederate skirmishers, creeping through the maze, shot down the gunners and the teams, and Stark, who had succeeded Jones, led the Valley regiments once more into the open field. The battle swayed backwards and forwards under the clouds of smoke. The crash of musketry, reverberating in the woods, drowned the roar of the artillery, and though hundreds were shot down at the shortest range, neither Federal nor Confederate flinched from the dreadful fray. Hooker sent in a fresh brigade, and Patrick, reinforcing Gibbon with 4 regiments, passed swiftly to the front, captured 2 colours, and made some headway. But again the Virginians rallied, and Stark, observing that the enemy's right had become exposed, led his regiments forward to the charge. Doubleday's division, struck fiercely in front and flank, reeled back in confusion past the Miller House, and although the gallant Stark fell dead, the Confederates recovered the ground which they had lost. Jackson's men had not been left unaided. Colonel Lee's guns had themselves to look to, for along the whole course of the Antietam, McClellan's batteries were now in action, sweeping the Sharpsburg Ridge with a tremendous fire. But Stuart, west of the Nicodemus farm, had done much to embarrass Hooker's operations. Bringing his artillery into action, for the ground was unsuited to cavalry, he had distracted the aim of the Federal gunners, and, assailing their infantry and flank, had compelled Doubleday to detach a portion of his force against him. Jackson, with supreme confidence in the ability of his men to hold their ground, had not hesitated to reinforce Stuart with Early's brigade, the strongest in his command. But before Doubleday was beaten back, Early had been recalled.